March 17, 1943, 400 miles east of Newfoundland. The North Atlantic. Through the attack periscope of U-boat 305, and this contempt was not born of idle arrogance. For nearly 4 years, German U-boats had feasted in these waters with an efficiency that terrified Allied planners. In 1942 alone, Operation Drumbeat, the campaign against American coastal shipping, had sent 609 Allied vessels to the bottom. 3.1 million tons of shipping obliterated in a slaughter so one-sided that U-boat crews called it the second happy time. Captain Lieutenant Barr himself had sunk 14 ships in 2 patrols, watched freighters and tankers erupt in towers of flame from his torpedoes, surfaced to machine gun lifeboats when time permitted, and returned to French ports, where smiling girls placed flower wreaths around the necks of heroes. Admiral Dönitz, commander of the U-boat arm, had promised his wolf packs would starve Britain into submission by cutting the Atlantic lifeline. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Germany was sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them, and the Royal Navy simply didn't have enough destroyers to protect every convoy. When intelligence reports began arriving in early 1943 about American plans to mass-produce small destroyer escorts using prefabricated sections and merchant shipyard techniques, German naval staff actually welcomed the news. These vessels, they calculated, would be precisely what Americans always built: crude, hastily constructed, quantity over quality. They would break down in Atlantic storms, their inexperienced crews would panic under depth charge attack, and their weak armament would pose no serious threat to a properly handled U-boat. Barr had read the intelligence assessments himself. Maximum speed of only 24 knots compared to a destroyer's 35, half the gun armament, crews composed of reserve sailors rather than career professionals. These were not warships, these were floating compromises, desperate measures from a nation that didn't understand naval warfare. But what they didn't know, what Barr and his comrades celebrating in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire couldn't possibly grasp, as they studied the inadequate specifications of these toy boats, was that in exactly 14 months, by May 1944, those same U-boat commanders would be referring to mid-Atlantic convoy routes as the Valley of Death. They didn't know that the distinctive pinging of American sonar sets, a sound sharper and more persistent than British ASDIC, would become the last thing hundreds of U-boat crews heard before their pressure hulls imploded. They didn't know that by war's end, 783 German submarines, more than the Kriegsmarine built during the entire conflict, would rest on the ocean floor, and that 28,000 of their 40,000 submariners would never see home again, the highest casualty rate of any service in any nation during World War II. They couldn't comprehend that American shipyards would complete destroyer escorts at a rate of 4 per week at peak production, launching hulls faster than Germany could train replacement crews, transforming the Atlantic from a U-boat hunting ground into a graveyard where the hunters became the hunted. This story is about how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how German U-boat commanders' laughter turned to terror as they discovered what American destroyer escorts could do when backed by bottomless resources, relentless training, and crews who refused to stop hunting until every submarine contact ended in oil slicks and wreckage. But that March morning, Commander Frederick Hall, captain of USS Brennan DE-13, one of the first destroyer escorts to enter combat operations, understood what the Admiralty and American public didn't yet know. Standing on his bridge as his vessel pitched through 20-foot swells, watching his inexperienced crew struggle with equipment that had barely been tested before deployment, Hall knew his ship represented a colossal gamble. The Navy had ordered 563 of these vessels before a single prototype had proven itself in combat. His crew, average age 22, most had never seen the ocean before. Boot camp were learning anti-submarine warfare in the most dangerous classroom on Earth. His ship's sonar operator had exactly 6 weeks of training. His gunnery officer had qualified only 2 months earlier. Half his depth charge team had never actually dropped live charges until their first convoy 3 weeks ago. The British destroyer captains who saw his vessel entering Londonderry Harbour had openly laughed, one remarking that it looked like a merchant ship cosplaying as a warship. Hall kept a Royal Navy assessment in his cabin, a brutally honest evaluation that concluded American destroyer escorts were inadequate for sustained anti-submarine operations in North Atlantic conditions. Inadequate. That single word haunted him because he knew the assessment was technically correct. His ship was slower than U-boats running on the surface. his sonar had blind spots. His depth charges were an old British design. His crew were children playing at naval warfare, while experienced U-boat commanders with 4 years of combat experience hunted them. And yet, and this was what kept Hall awake during his watch, the orders were clear: locate, pursue, and destroy. Not discourage, not defend, destroy. The US Navy had built these inadequate vessels with exactly one purpose: to kill submarines until none remained. Whether his crew or his ship were actually ready for that mission was no longer relevant. The convoys were sailing, the U-boats were hunting, and destroyer escorts like Brennan were all that stood between merchant crews and the torpedo rooms of Dönitz's wolf packs. Through U-305's periscope, Barr watched the small American vessel take up station on the convoy's flank, her wake white against the grey Atlantic, her crew tiny figures moving on deck. He smiled. This was going to be easier than expected. The convoy had posted 3 escorts, 1 British corvette showing her age, 1 ancient American flush-deck destroyer, and now this toy boat that looked like it might capsize in a strong wind. His wolf pack consisted of 7 U-boats, all positioned along the convoy's projected route. They would strike at dusk, overwhelm the inadequate defences, and feast on the 30 fat merchantmen steaming in neat columns. By dawn, half those ships would be sinking or burning, their cargoes lost, their crews in lifeboats watching the dawn break over empty ocean. And the American destroyer Escort? She would be racing in circles, dropping depth charges at random, her sonar confused by the churning water and multiple submarine contacts, her inexperienced crew panicking as torpedo wakes crisscrossed the convoy lanes. Barr had seen it 100 times. Escorts were designed to defend. U-boats were designed to attack. The mathematics always favoured the attacker. He lowered the periscope and ordered his boat to deep running depth. In 6 hours, when twilight came, they would show these Americans what happened when toy boats faced real warships, commanded by professional killers who had been hunting these waters since 1939. The Battle of the Atlantic belonged to Germany, and no amount of hastily built vessels crewed by children would change that fundamental reality. The destroyer escort program was born not from careful naval planning but from desperation bordering on panic. In June 1940, when France fell and Britain stood alone, First Sea Lord Admiral Dudley Pound sent a classified cable to Washington that contained a single terrifying sentence: "We are 6 months from losing the war at sea. British shipyards, built for quality over speed, could produce perhaps 4 destroyers per year. Germany was launching 2 U-boats per week. The mathematics were murderous." Someone in the Navy Department, studying merchant ship construction techniques, asked a heretical question. What if we built warships like cargo vessels? What if we abandoned centuries of naval craftsmanship, the carefully fitted frames, the hand-riveted seams, the precision engineering, and instead welded together prefabricated sections using techniques pioneered by Henry Kaiser's emergency shipyards? The result was a bastard design that satisfied no one. Too slow to catch surfaced submarines, too lightly armed to fight destroyers, too small for Atlantic storms, too crude for naval purists who believed warships required years of careful construction. The Navy's own Bureau of Ships initially rejected the concept, calling it fundamentally unsound. When the first destroyer escort, USS Evarts, underwent sea trials in April 1943, she rolled so badly in moderate seas that half the crew became violently seasick. Her diesel engines, chosen because they were cheaper and more available than turbines, vibrated so intensely that instruments shattered and rivets popped loose. Her sonar, mounted too close to the propellers, picked up more noise from her own machinery than from submarine contacts. Test reports were damning. Vessel unsuitable for extended operations without substantial redesign. But redesign would take time, and time was the one commodity the Allies didn't possess. So the Navy did something unprecedented. They ordered 563 destroyer escorts, before fixing the problems, before training the crews, before anyone knew if the design would actually work in combat. It was the largest procurement gamble in naval history, and for the first 6 months of 1943, it appeared to be a catastrophic mistake. Training casualties were horrific. D crews, learning anti-submarine warfare in the unforgiving North Atlantic, lost vessels to storms, to collisions, to mechanical failures that left them dead in the water, with U-boats prowling nearby. Commander Ernest Evans, tasked with training DE crews at the Atlantic Fleet's submarine school, kept a private log that he later burned. but fragments survived. In one entry, he wrote, "Today we lost D-23 to boiler explosion, 12 dead. Yesterday, D-49 collided with a freighter in fog, 6 more casualties. These ships are killing our own men faster than submarines ever could. I am sending children into combat in vessels that barely float, and I lie awake knowing most won't survive their first patrol." The British were even more scathing. Royal Navy reports circulated through Admiralty House, describing American destroyer escorts as colonial improvisation, vessels that combined every vice of merchant construction with none of the virtues of proper warship design. When the first DEs arrived at Londonderry to join escort groups, British destroyer captains refused to coordinate with them, certain these crude vessels would panic under depth charge attack and endanger properly trained warships. Even American destroyer crews looked down on their smaller cousins. Sailors on real destroyers' vessels with names like Fletcher and Sumner called DE crews, Donald Duck's Navy, mocking their smaller size and perceived inadequacy. There was a saying that circulated through Atlantic ports: "The only thing worse than being on a DE is being on a merchant ship escorted by one." Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, received so many complaints about destroyer escort performance during early 1943 that he seriously considered cancelling the program entirely and redirecting resources to building more conventional destroyers, even though that would mean cutting production by 75%. The destroyer escort seemed destined to become a footnote in naval history, an example of how industrial thinking couldn't replace proper maritime engineering and tradition. Then came the morning of April 16th, 1943, and everything changed. USS England, DE 635, was 3 months into her first deployment, escorting a convoy designated SC-127 through waters 600 miles south of Iceland. Lieutenant Commander Walton Pendleton commanded a crew that averaged 19 years old. Most had never been to sea before their destroyer escort training. His sonar operator, Seaman First Class Robert Harper, had qualified exactly 8 weeks earlier. They were hunting U-415, a Type Sevier submarine commanded by Captain Lieutenant Kurt Neider, a veteran with 16 kills, and the Iron Cross First Class. The engagement began at 0314 hours, when Harper picked up a contact at 2,800 yards. Pendleton ordered full speed, his ship accelerating to her maximum 24 knots, which felt glacial compared to destroyer speeds, but was fast enough. They dropped a pattern of depth charges. The explosions sent columns of water 200 feet high, but the sonar contact disappeared. Standard procedure demanded they continue with the convoy. Instead, Pendleton did something that violated every tactical manual. He stopped his ship and listened. For 27 minutes, England sat motionless in the middle of the Atlantic, her engines silent, while Harper operated his sonar in passive mode, simply listening for the sound of U-415's electric motors. "I could hear my own heartbeat," Harper later recorded in his patrol diary. The entire ship was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Commander Pendleton stood directly behind me, his hand on my shoulder. Then I heard it, a faint mechanical whine, bearing 173, range maybe 1,200 yards. The U-boat was trying to creep away on electric power, moving at perhaps 2 knots, staying deep to avoid detection. Standard doctrine said to drop depth charges in a wide pattern and hope for a lucky hit. But England's crew had practiced a different technique during their shakedown cruise. They crept toward the contact at bare steerage way, closing to point-blank range 400 yards, then 300, then 200, until Harper could hear not just the U-boat's motors, but individual machinery sounds. The hum of her electric pumps, the whine of her rudder mechanism, even what might have been voices through the pressure hull. At 0347 hours, at a range of 180 yards, so close that a torpedo couldn't have armed itself before impact, Pendleton ordered a full depth charge pattern dropped directly on top of U-415. 24 depth charges, set to detonate at 3 different depths, created a killing zone of overlapping shockwaves that no submarine could survive. Aboard U-415, Neider was consulting charts when the first explosion hit. The U-boat lifted 6 feet, her hull flexing like a tin can crushed by a giant's fist. Emergency lights shattered. The pressure gauge for the aft torpedo room spun to 0. The compartment had imploded. Then the second wave of charges detonated, and the third, 13 explosions in 9 seconds, each one compressing the submarine's hull beyond its engineering tolerance. Seawater flooded through sprung seams. The electric motors screamed as their mountings broke loose. The entire aft section crumpled like aluminum foil. "We were dead," Naidoo wrote in a statement recorded 3 hours later, after England had fished him, and 14 survivors from the oil-slicked water, dead men trying to understand why we were still breathing. My chief engineer told me the pressure hull had ruptured in 4 places. We had no power, no steering, no buoyancy control. We were sinking past crush depth, and somehow not imploding. Then another explosion hit, and another, and I realized they weren't trying to sink us. They were trying to disintegrate us. No British destroyer had ever attacked with such concentrated precision. No corvette had ever stayed on contact so relentlessly. When we surfaced to abandon ship, I expected to see a real warship, a fleet destroyer, or maybe a cruiser. Instead, I saw that small vessel, that toy boat we had been warned to ignore, sitting 300 meters away with every gun trained on our conning tower. And I understood too late, far too late, that we had been hunting the wrong prey. The wreckage of U-415 stayed afloat for 12 minutes, long enough for England's crew to photograph the massive holes torn in her pressure hull, damage so extensive that naval architects who later examined the photos initially believed they were fake. No depth charge attack had ever inflicted such complete destruction. British anti-submarine experts who reviewed England's patrol report focused on one detail that seemed impossible. The destroyer Escort had maintained sonar contact through her own depth charge attack, something that required acoustic equipment far more sophisticated than anyone had believed the crude American vessels possessed. When questioned, Harper explained that England's sonar used a new signal processing system that filtered out explosion echoes while maintaining target tracking. It was experimental technology that had been installed in destroyer escorts almost as an afterthought, because the vessels were new designs where untested equipment could be integrated without modifying existing systems. The news of U-415's destruction reached U-boat headquarters in Paris on April 17th. Admiral Dönitz's initial reaction was recorded in his war diary. "Single U-boat, lost to unknown cause, probably mine. No further concern." But when survivors reached Britain, and Naidoo gave his statement, copies were distributed to German naval intelligence within 48 hours. The reaction among U-boat commanders was immediate and visceral. They had lost submarines before to aircraft, to destroyers, to mines, to accidents. But this was different. This was a small escort vessel, something they had been specifically told to dismiss as inadequate, hunting with a skill level that exceeded anything the Royal Navy had demonstrated. Captain Zur, C. Reinhard Hardigan, who had commanded the most successful Operation Drumbeat Patrol, wrote in a letter intercepted by Allied censors, "If the Americans can build hundreds of these vessels and crew them with operators who hunt like this, we are hunting in waters that are hunting us back. This changes everything." But Dönitz didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. One lucky attack didn't indicate a pattern. U-415 had probably made a tactical error, maintained too much speed on electric power, failed to go deep enough. The American destroyer Escort remained, in official German naval assessment, inadequate for sustained anti-submarine operations. The wolf packs continued their attacks. The convoys continued sailing. And in American shipyards, destroyer escorts continued rolling off production lines at a rate that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. What German intelligence didn't know, what couldn't know, because the information was more closely guarded than even ultra-decrypts, was that England's attack had validated the entire destroyer escort concept. Every tactical innovation Pendleton had employed was immediately distributed to other DE captains. The silent listening technique, the point-blank attack approach, the use of concentrated depth charge patterns. Within 6 weeks, 12 more destroyer escorts had sunk U-boats using variations of England's tactics. The inadequate vessels were learning to kill, and they were learning faster than U-boats could adapt. The hunter's advantage was evaporating. The mathematics that had favored wolf pack attacks were shifting toward a new equation, one where American industrial capacity, multiplied by tactical innovation, equaled something German submariners had never experienced in 4 years of warfare. Genuine, systematic, unavoidable danger every time they approached a convoy. The laughter was fading from U-boat mess halls, fear was replacing confidence, and in the shipyards of America, the production lines accelerated. Captain Daniel Gallery was not a conventional naval officer, and that unconventionality made him perfect for commanding the experimental hunter-killer group built around escort carriers and destroyer escorts. In July 1943, when the Atlantic Fleet assigned him command of Task Group 22.3 USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts, his orders were deceptively simple: develop tactics to actively hunt U-boats rather than merely defend convoys. Gallery looked at those orders and saw an opportunity to rewrite 4 centuries of naval doctrine. Traditional anti-submarine warfare was reactive. Submarines attacked, escorts defended. The hunter chose when and where to strike. The prey could only respond. Gallery intended to reverse that relationship entirely. His innovation began with a heretical observation: destroyer escorts were being used incorrectly. The Navy deployed them as convoy defenders, spreading them thin across hundreds of convoys, diluting their effectiveness. But Gallery recognized what the Bureau of Ships had accidentally created: not a defender, but a specialized predator perfectly evolved for a single purpose. Destroyer escorts were slow compared to fleet destroyers, yes, but they were faster than a submerged U-boat running on electric motors. They had endurance that fleet destroyers lacked: fuel capacity for 6,000 miles compared to a destroyer's 3,500, which meant they could pursue a contact for days instead of hours. Their diesel engines were quieter than destroyer turbines, making their sonar more effective. And most critically, they were being mass-produced fast enough that losses didn't matter. A fleet destroyer sinking represented 2 years of construction and a veteran crew lost. A destroyer escort could be replaced in 6 weeks, and her crew of reservists trained in 3 months. Gallery wrote new tactical rules that he distributed to every DE captain in his group, rules that explicitly rejected conventional wisdom. Rule 1. Never break off contact. If you have sonar contact with a U-boat, you pursue until you kill it or your fuel runs out, even if that means abandoning convoy escort duty. Rule 2. Hunt in packs. 3 destroyer escorts working together can maintain continuous contact while rotating attack runs, giving the submarine no opportunity to escape. Rule 3. Use your limitations. Your slow speed means you can creep toward a contact at 5 knots, quieter than a submarine trying to evade, close to knife-fighting range where depth charges become surgical weapons instead of area bombardment. Rule 4. Make them surface. A U-boat submerged can run for perhaps 60 hours on electric power. Keep attacking, keep forcing them to maneuver, drain their batteries. Eventually they must surface, and when they do, you kill them with gunfire before they can dive again. Rule 5. The rule that would transform the Atlantic campaign. Attack until you see wreckage. Oil slicks can be faked, bubbles can be air pockets, debris can be dumped garbage. You continue attacking until you see bodies, interior equipment, or pieces of pressure hull floating to the surface. Anything less means the submarine is still alive and still hunting. The Kriegsmarine learned about these new tactics the hard way during the catastrophic months of May and June 1943. U-boat Group Trutz, 5 submarines working in coordinated wolfpack formation, was stalking convoy HX 239 inches mid-Atlantic when they encountered Task Group 22.3. The engagement that followed became a case study in how industrial warfare destroyed tactical brilliance. Kapitänleutnant Johann Mohr, commanding U-124, was one of Germany's most decorated submarine aces with 27 ships sunk. He had survived 3 years of combat by mastering the art of evasion, diving deep, running silent, using thermal layers to confuse sonar, dumping oil and debris to fake destruction. His techniques had defeated British destroyers and corvettes dozens of times. Against Gallery's destroyer escorts, those techniques became death traps. The attack began at 0230 hours on May 12th, when USS Pillsbury detected U-124 at 3,200 yards. Mohr executed a textbook evasion, crash dive to 400 feet, cut all non-essential systems, creep southeast at 2 knots on minimal power. 30 minutes later, he heard depth charge explosions far astern exactly where he expected, where his submarine would have been if he hadn't changed course. Standard procedure suggested the destroyer escort would search the area, find nothing, and return to convoy duty. Instead, 2 hours later, another destroyer, Escort USS Pope, reacquired contact and attacked again. Then USS Chatelaine joined the pursuit, then Flaherty, then Pillsbury returned. For 17 hours, Gallery's destroyers rotated attack runs while maintaining continuous sonar contact, never letting U-124 break free. never stopping long enough for her to reload torpedo tubes or make emergency repairs. I knew we were going to die around hour 12, Moore wrote in a message scrawled on the back of a navigation chart, later recovered from the wreck by deep-sea salvage teams in 1958. My chief engineer reported battery power at 18%. Air quality was becoming toxic carbon dioxide buildup, causing headaches and nausea. Hull integrity was compromised from repeated depth charge near misses. We were at 460 feet, well past safe depth, and the pressure hull was groaning with every maneuver. My sonar operator could hear all 4 escorts tracking us, their active sonar pinging so frequently it sounded like one continuous tone. They weren't searching, they were tracking. They knew exactly where we were every second, and they were herding us like wolves pack-hunting a wounded deer. At hour 15, we surfaced to recharge batteries. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they opened fire. We managed to get the diesel engine running when the first shells arrived. Not the wild, scattered fire of a panicked escort. Precise, measured salvos. The forward gun mount exploded. The pressure hull was holed. Water flooded the control room. I ordered abandon ship, knowing most of my crew wouldn't reach the surface. As I climbed through the conning tower hatch, I saw all 4 American vessels in a perfect diamond formation, 800 meters away, every gun aimed at my submarine like a firing squad. They weren't defending anything, they weren't reacting to our attack, they were hunting us, and they had been hunting us with perfect coordination for 17 hours straight. This wasn't naval combat as I understood it. This was industrial extermination. Gallery's task group sank 4 submarines in 8 days using these tactics, a kill rate that exceeded anything achieved during the entire war. The British Admiralty, initially skeptical of American methods, sent observers who watched in astonishment as destroyer escorts pursued contacts with mechanical precision, rotated crews to maintain continuous operations, and expended depth charges with a profligacy that seemed insane until you realized American production could replace them faster than they could be used. A Royal Navy report dated June 1943 reversed every previous assessment. American destroyer escorts, when properly employed in hunter-killer groups, represent the most effective anti-submarine platform currently in service. Their effectiveness is not despite their mass production origins but because of them. They are warfare industrialized. But the doctrine shift was only half the equation. In September 1943, American destroyer escorts began receiving a technological upgrade that transformed them from dangerous predators into unstoppable killers. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. Previous depth charge attacks required the escort to pass directly over the submarine's position, which meant losing sonar contact during the critical attack phase. Hedgehog fired 24 projectiles in an elliptical pattern 200 yards ahead of the ship, allowing the attacker to maintain sonar contact throughout the engagement. More importantly, Hedgehog projectiles only exploded on contact with a solid object. Near misses produced no explosions, which meant if you heard detonations, you knew you'd hit the target. This seemingly simple change created psychological devastation among U-boat crews. Oberleutnant Zur, see Hans Werner, executive officer of U-358, kept a diary that captured the terror of facing Hedgehog-equipped destroyer escorts. His entry from October 23, 1943, was written in shaking handwriting. We detected the destroyer escort at 0400, bearing 310 degrees, range 4,000 meters. Commander Rowing ordered crash dive and evasion maneuver. Standard procedure, we had done this successfully 18 times before. At 280 meters depth, we heard the sonar pings, that sharp metallic sound the Americans use, different from the deeper British ASDIC. The escort was closing, but we were deep and silent. Then I heard a sound I had never encountered before, not the whistling of falling depth charges, but a rapid series of splashes, 20 or 30 objects entering the water simultaneously. Commander Rowing looked at our sonar operator, confused. Then the first projectile hit our outer hull near the bow torpedo room. The explosion was smaller than a depth charge, but far more terrifying because it meant direct contact. Then another hit. Then another. In 8 seconds, we counted 11 impacts spread across our entire length. The pressure hull held, but barely. Oil lines ruptured. The forward ballast tank was breached. We were trailing oil and debris. The commander ordered emergency surface, knowing we couldn't survive another attack pattern. But here's what haunts me. Between the splashes and the explosions, there was silence. When depth charges miss, they still explode, and you hear them, and there's almost relief in the sound because it means they didn't kill you. With this new weapon, silence meant they missed, and explosions meant they hit. And they had hit us 11 times. 11 direct impacts from a single spread. The mathematics of that accuracy terrified me more than the damage. This wasn't probability anymore. This was certainty. If they attacked again, we would die. Not might die, would die. U-358 surfaced and scuttled herself, rather than face another hedgehog attack. Similar reports began flooding into U-boat headquarters from across the Atlantic. German naval intelligence, analyzing the debris patterns and survivor accounts, realized the Americans had developed a weapon that removed the fundamental uncertainty from anti-submarine warfare. Previously, depth charge attacks were probability games, blanket an area with explosives, and hope one detonated close enough to rupture the pressure hull. Hedgehog turned it into targeted killing. American destroyer escorts could now fire, maintain sonar contact, watch their projectiles track toward the target, and immediately assess results. If they heard explosions, they knew the U-boat was damaged or destroyed. If they heard silence, they adjusted aim and fired again. The learning curve compressed from months to minutes. By December 1943, 63 destroyer escorts had been equipped with Hedgehog systems. U-boat losses in the Atlantic spiked to an average of 12 per month, triple the rate from early 1943. Dönitz's war diary entries became increasingly desperate. American anti-submarine capabilities have exceeded all projections. Our submarines are being destroyed at a rate that makes Atlantic operations unsustainable. The small escorts we dismissed as inadequate are killing our boats with efficiency that suggests systematic, technological superiority, not luck. His staff recommended withdrawing U-boats from the North Atlantic entirely, conceding the convoy routes to Allied control. Dönitz refused, ordering boats to continue attacks, convinced that German tactical skill could overcome American material advantages. That conviction would cost the Kriegsmarine another 420 submarines over the next 18 months. The U-boat crews knew what their admirals refused to accept. The Atlantic belonged to the Americans now, and those toy boats they had mocked were the reason why. Every convoy that sailed carried 3 or 4 destroyer escorts, each crewed by young men who had been trained on a single principle: locate, pursue, destroy. The defensive war was over. The hunting had begun. By June 1944, the statistics had become obscene. In the 18 months since USS England had killed U-415, American destroyer escorts had participated in the destruction of 127 U-boats, nearly 1/6 of all German submarine losses during the entire war. The kill-to-loss ratio was even more staggering. For every destroyer escort sunk by enemy action, American crews had destroyed 9 U-boats. But raw numbers told only part of the story. The psychological impact was far more devastating than any casualty report could capture. German submariners had developed a condition that Kriegsmarine medical officers officially termed Geleitbootangst, escort boat anxiety, but which crews simply called the shakes. The symptoms were unmistakable: uncontrollable trembling when sonar pinged against the hull, hyperventilation during depth charge attacks, complete paralysis when the distinctive splashing pattern of Hedgehog projectiles entered the water. U-boat commanders reported crews refusing to dive when destroyer escorts appeared on the horizon, men weeping uncontrollably in the control room, experienced petty officers requesting transfer to any other duty: minesweeping, E-boat service, even infantry combat on the Eastern Front, rather than face another patrol where American destroyer escorts might be hunting. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, one of Germany's surviving submarine aces, wrote in his post-war memoir about the transformation that occurred during late 1943 and early 1944. His description captured the existential terror that had replaced the cocky confidence of the happy time. We stopped calling them toy boats after the first dozen friends never returned. We stopped joking about inadequate American vessels after sonar operators reported hearing that distinctive, high-pitched ping, sharper than British ASDIC, more persistent, like being tapped by a metal hammer that never stopped, and knowing with absolute certainty that we had perhaps 5 minutes to live. By mid-1944, simply knowing a convoy was escorted by American destroyer escorts was enough to make experienced commanders abort attacks. We would track convoys for days, waiting for the escorts to leave, but they never left. They stayed with convoys from Halifax to Liverpool, 3,000 miles of continuous escort, and if one developed mechanical problems, another appeared within hours to take her place. The ocean became a cage, and the bars were those damned small ships that never stopped hunting, never ran out of depth charges, never broke off contact. I survived the war with 23 ships sunk, but I would wake up screaming about the sound of hedgehog projectiles splashing into water even 20 years later. The psychological warfare extended beyond individual engagements. American destroyer Escort crews developed a tactic that German survivors described as corpse parades. After sinking a U-boat, DE crews would deliberately cruise through the debris field at slow speed, sometimes for hours, observing the wreckage with binoculars, photographing bodies and equipment floating to the surface, making no attempt to rescue survivors until they had confirmed total destruction. The tactic served a practical purpose, ensuring the submarine was truly dead, but the psychological impact on U-boat crews listening via hydrophone from nearby boats was devastating. They could hear their comrades dying, hear the American propellers circling the killing zone, hear the splashes as bodies were eventually pulled from the water for intelligence purposes, and they understood with perfect clarity. This was their future. This was what awaited them the next time they attacked a convoy. Not the honorable death of combat, but methodical extermination, followed by casual observation while they drowned. The apex predator behavior reached its peak during Black May 1944, when American hunter-killer groups systematically cleared entire patrol zones of U-boats. Task Group 22.3. Captain Gallery's original experimental unit sank 6 submarines in 17 days. Task Group 21.16 destroyed 5 U-boats in 11 days. The tactics had evolved beyond simple pursuit. Destroyer escorts now operated in coordinated groups of 4 to 6 vessels, creating barriers that submarines couldn't cross without being detected. They used high-frequency direction, finding huff-duff to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions and vector toward contacts before submarines even knew they'd been located. They coordinated with escort carrier aircraft to maintain 24-hour surveillance over convoy routes, with destroyer escorts immediately responding to any aircraft sighting. The hunting had become so efficient that U-boat headquarters was receiving radio messages from submarines in mid-Atlantic reporting contact with American escorts. Then, silence. No distress calls. No follow-up reports. Just silence. And 6 weeks later, notification that the boat was officially listed as missing, with all hands lost. But the true obscenity, the factor that transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a contest into a massacre, was not visible from any U-boat periscope. It was happening 3,000 miles away, in American shipyards that had revolutionized warship construction with techniques that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. The Bethlehem Steel Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, had been retooled in 1942 to mass-produce destroyer escorts using modular construction techniques. The process was more automobile assembly line than traditional naval architecture. Prefabricated sections, bow modules, stern sections, engine rooms, crew quarters were manufactured in different parts of the facility by workers who had never built ships before. Housewives who had been sewing curtains 6 months earlier were now welding pressure hull sections. Farmers were operating cranes that lifted 30-ton engine modules into position. High school students were installing sonar equipment and fire control systems. The entire destroyer escort could be assembled in 45 days, from keel laying to launch, with another 30 days for sea trials and commissioning. At peak production in early 1944, Bethlehem Quincy was launching 1 destroyer escort every 11 days. The Kaiser Shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, achieved even more absurd production rates, 1 DE every 8 days, using workers who averaged 6 months of shipbuilding experience. Across the United States, 19 shipyards were simultaneously producing destroyer escorts. The numbers became almost meaningless through sheer scale. 563 destroyer escorts authorized, 517 actually built, with production distributed across facilities from Maine to California. The ships were being launched faster than crews could be trained. Training facilities at Norfolk, Charleston, and San Diego were running 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, processing 1,200 new sailors per week through accelerated anti-submarine warfare programs. The Navy was commissioning destroyer escorts so rapidly that ship numbers became confused. DE-173 was commissioned before DE-165, DE-201 before DE-189. because ships were completed whenever their specific modules were ready, not in numerical sequence. By June 1944, American yards were launching destroyer escorts faster than Germany had built U-boats during any comparable period of the war. The industrial advantage was so overwhelming that even if every single destroyer escort had been sunk within a month of commissioning, American yards would still have been adding ships to the fleet faster than they could be destroyed. The Germans knew these numbers. Intelligence reports detailing American production capacity reached Berlin regularly through neutral sources, diplomatic channels, and analysis of ship commissioning announcements in American newspapers. Kriegsmarine staff officers did the mathematics and understood what it meant. Germany could not win an attrition campaign against an economy capable of this level of production. But understanding the numbers intellectually was different from grasping their practical implications until you were a U-boat commander watching those mass-produced vessels hunt with relentless efficiency. The decisive moment, the anecdote that perfectly captured how industrial might had made tactical excellence irrelevant, occurred on June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day. During a Wolfpack attack on convoy Cu-29, 7 U-boats, the surviving veterans of Group Landwehr, had positioned themselves along the convoy's route south of Ireland. These were experienced boats commanded by experienced men, survivors, who had adapted to every previous Allied countermeasure, who had developed new tactics to counter hedgehog attacks, who represented the absolute peak of German submarine warfare expertise. They executed a textbook coordinated assault at twilight, launching torpedoes from 3 different bearings simultaneously, sinking 2 merchant ships and damaging a tanker in the first 90 seconds. The attack should have been a triumph, a demonstration that tactical skill could still overcome material superiority. Instead, it became a funeral. The convoy's escort included 6 destroyer escorts, 4 of which had been commissioned within the previous 60 days. USS Haverfield, DE 393, had been in combat for exactly 19 days. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Vincent Healy, was 32 years old and had never commanded any vessel before receiving his destroyer escort assignment 8 weeks earlier. His crew averaged 21 years of age and 6 months of naval service. By any reasonable standard, they should have been hopelessly outmatched by veteran U-boat commanders with 4 years of combat experience. Instead, Haverfield sonar operator, a 19-year-old from Iowa who had been operating sonar equipment for exactly 7 weeks, detected U-455 at 2,900 yards, while the submarine was still approaching to fire. Her second spread of torpedoes. Healy ordered an immediate hedgehog attack. 24 projectiles bracketed U-455's position. 8 struck the pressure hull. The submarine's batteries exploded, flooding the boat with chlorine gas. 37 men died before she could surface. The other 5 destroyer escorts, coordinating through recently installed voice radio systems, established a sonar barrier that trapped the remaining 6 U-boats inside a 20-square-mile kill zone. The hunt lasted 14 hours. 3 U-boats were sunk by hedgehog attacks. 2 surfaced to scuttle after suffering catastrophic damage from depth charges. 1 attempted to escape on the surface at maximum speed and was obliterated by concentrated gunfire from 4 destroyer escorts firing simultaneously. The 7th submarine, U-413, managed to evade detection for 8 hours by sitting motionless on the ocean floor at 600 feet depth, far below her design crush depth, her crew certain they were going to implode at any moment. When her commander finally decided to surface before the crew suffocated from carbon dioxide poisoning, he found all 6 destroyer escorts still circling the area, waiting, their sonar never having stopped pinging. He surrendered immediately. Not 1 destroyer escort was damaged during the engagement. The patrol report filed by Lieutenant Commander Healy was 2 pages long and written in matter-of-fact language that betrayed no recognition of how remarkable the action had been. The after-action review by Atlantic Fleet staff noted with clinical precision, "Task unit destroyed entire enemy Wolfpack with 0 friendly casualties, employing standardized tactics against veteran opponents. Engagement validates effectiveness of mass production vessels crewed by minimally trained personnel." That last phrase, minimally trained personnel, became a source of bitter humor among DE crews. They were children playing with industrial weapons, and they had just exterminated an entire U-boat pack, commanded by Iron Cross recipients, who had been hunting these waters since 1939. When news of the massacre reached U-boat headquarters, Kapitän zur See Eberhard Gott, Chief of Operations, experienced something approaching mental breakdown. His response, recorded in War Diary entry 223/44, captured the moment Germany's naval leadership finally understood they had lost. 7 boats, 12 torpedo hits, 2 freighters sunk, and in exchange, 7 boats destroyed in a single action by vessels we classified as inadequate. The mathematics are impossible. These boats are commanded by men with weeks of experience, crewed by children, built in shipyards by workers who don't know naval architecture. And they killed 7 boats that represented 30 combined years of operational experience. This isn't warfare. This is industry-crushing artisanship. And we cannot compete with industry. Every combat report, every survivor interview, every intelligence assessment tells the same story. The Americans are building these vessels faster than we can sink them, training crews faster than we can kill them, and improving their equipment with every production run, while we struggle to maintain the boats we already have. Admiral Dönitz demands we continue operations. But continuing operations means sending boys to certain death in boats that cannot survive contact with American escorts. I am ordering men to commit suicide by deploying into an ocean controlled by an enemy with unlimited resources and systematic killing methods. This is not a naval campaign anymore. This is execution. But Dönitz, isolated in his headquarters, reading sanitized reports that downplayed German losses and exaggerated American casualties, still believed the Atlantic could be won through superior German will and tactical innovation. He continued ordering U-boats into the North Atlantic shipping lanes, into the killing zones where destroyer escorts waited with full fuel tanks, fresh crews, and an endless supply of hedgehog projectiles. The massacres continued, the statistics climbed, and in American shipyards, the production lines accelerated, preparing for the final phase of the campaign, where the hunters would become an unstoppable tide that would sweep the last U-boats from the ocean entirely. The production lines fell silent in the summer of 1945, but the echoes continued. In interview rooms across occupied Germany, in prison cells at Nuremberg, in quiet Hamburg apartments where survivors gathered to drink and try not to remember, the reckoning came in whispers and confessions that no one had imagined possible during those confident days of 1943. Admiral Karl Dönitz sat across from American naval interrogators in June 1947, his uniform gone, his grand strategy reduced to transcripts and footnotes. When asked to identify what had cost Germany the Battle of the Atlantic, he paused for nearly a minute, long enough that the stenographer noted the silence in the official record. Then he spoke, and his words contained no defiance, no strategic rationalization, only the bitter acknowledgement of a man who had sent 28,000 submariners to their deaths based on a miscalculation so fundamental it still seemed impossible. We made a catastrophic error in 1943, one that I personally authored and refused to correct despite mounting evidence. We assessed your destroyer escorts based on technical specifications, speed, armament, construction quality, and concluded they were inadequate for serious anti-submarine work. This assessment was technically correct and strategically worthless. What we failed to comprehend was that adequacy became irrelevant when you could produce adequate vessels in unlimited numbers, crew them with enthusiastic amateurs who learned faster than our veterans could adapt, and equip them with technology that evolved monthly while ours stagnated. We were not defeated by superior seamanship. You buried us under an avalanche of mass-produced steel, and we drowned in it. The confession rippled through surviving U-boat commanders like a depth charge detonating in slow motion. Gross Admiral Erich Raeder was even more brutal in his Nuremberg testimony, his voice steady as he dissected the institutional arrogance that had killed thousands. The destroyer escort program represented everything German naval tradition despised: quantity over quality, industrial methods over craftsmanship, amateur crews over professional seamanship, and it destroyed us precisely because we despised it. We dismissed these vessels as toys right up until the moment they started killing our submarines faster than we could build replacements. By mid-1944, our crews feared American destroyer escorts more than British destroyers or carrier aircraft. You had industrialized submarine hunting, turned it into a production process. We had no counter to systematic extermination. But the most devastating acknowledgement came not from admirals defending their decisions to tribunals, but from the men who had survived the hunting. Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, Germany's highest-scoring ace, gave an interview in 1968 that captured something beyond military analysis, a psychological wound that had never healed. I was fortunate to be captured in 1941, before your ships arrived in force. My friends who continued operating through 1943 and 1944, the few who survived came back broken. They described something worse than fear. They described certainty. Once they heard that sound, that high-frequency ping your escorts used, experienced commanders would abort attacks and creep away. Not because they might die, because they would die. The mathematics were absolute. If you attacked, they found you. If they found you, they pursued until your batteries died. If you surfaced, they killed you. That wasn't warfare. That was execution. That sound. Always, in every testimony, every memoir, every survivor interview, the stories returned to that sound. The ping that was sharper than British ASDIC, more persistent, that seemed to penetrate steel and flesh equally. Oberleutnant Hans Goebeler, who survived 7 different U-boat patrols, could still reproduce it perfectly 20 years later. You would hear that ping strike your hull at 300 meters depth, in complete darkness. And you knew. You knew that somewhere above, a teenager who had never seen ocean before 1943 was watching a screen, tracking your exact position, coordinating with other escorts to box you in. We called it the death knock. Once you heard it, your survival odds dropped below 10%. I heard it 13 times. I survived through luck, nothing more. But I knew men, good men, experienced submariners who heard that ping and simply gave up. They would sit in the control room and wait for the hedgehog projectiles, because fighting was pointless. You would just keep coming until we died. The hedgehog splash. That was the other sound that haunted them. The rapid series of small splashes, 24 projectiles entering water simultaneously, followed by either silence that meant reprieve or detonations that meant death. Unlike depth charges, which exploded whether they hit or missed, hedgehog projectiles only detonated on contact. Silence meant survival. Explosions meant your hull had been struck. And if you heard explosions, you had perhaps 30 seconds before the pressure hull failed and the Atlantic crushed you into paste. German survivors described nightmares decades later where they would wake in cold sweats, certain they heard those splashes, that their ceiling was about to explode inward with the force of 1,000 atmospheres. By late 1944, the psychological toll had destroyed the U-boat service more completely than any military campaign. Kriegsmarine records revealed that volunteers stopped coming forward not because Germany lacked personnel, but because men would do anything, claim medical disability, volunteer for penal battalions on the Eastern Front, even shoot themselves in the foot rather than deploy against American destroyer escorts. Medical officers reported epidemic levels of psychosomatic paralysis, blindness, seizures. Training bases saw suicide rates exceeding 20%. Men preferred death by their own hand to facing that ping, those splashes, that relentless pursuit by vessels they had once mocked. At a 1963 reunion in Hamburg for surviving U-boat veterans, fewer than 400 of 12,000 survivors attended. Many who were invited wrote back, explaining they couldn't bear the memories. One letter, kept anonymous in official records, ended with words that captured the complete reversal. We laughed when we first saw them, in 1943. We called them toy boats, inadequate vessels, milk bottles built by amateurs. We laughed at how easy it would be to overwhelm these crude escorts. We were apex predators, masters of the Atlantic. Then they started hunting us, and we realized we had been wrong about everything. The laughter died somewhere in mid-1944, choked off by that damned sonar ping echoing through our hull, signaling that another group of American children in their mass-produced vessels had found us and would hunt us until we died. By 1945, we weren't laughing, we weren't fighting. We were just waiting to die, thanking God each time we made it home before you finally caught us. The ocean had become a graveyard where 783 submarines rested on the bottom, their pressure hulls imploded, their crews entombed in steel coffins. 28,000 men, 7 out of every 10 who had ever served on a U-boat never saw home again, the highest casualty rate of any service, in any nation, during the entire war. And a staggering portion of those deaths could be traced to encounters with the vessels German commanders had dismissed as inadequate. The Battle of the Atlantic ended not with climactic confrontation, but with simple mathematical exhaustion. Germany ran out of submarines and men willing to crew them, while America still had hundreds of destroyer escorts ready to hunt and thousands of sailors ready to replace casualties. The transformation was complete. The prophecy, spoken in those first contemptuous glances through attack periscopes, had been fulfilled in ways no one could have imagined. The hunters had become the hunted, and the hunting had been systematic, relentless, industrial. In the end, it wasn't tactical brilliance or warrior ethos that decided the Atlantic. It was production lines and persistence, quantity merged with evolving quality, an industrial nation that had learned to build adequate vessels in overwhelming numbers and crew them with young men who were taught a single doctrine: locate, pursue, destroy. The destroyer escorts had executed that doctrine with mechanical precision until there were no targets left, until the ocean belonged entirely to the convoys they protected. The thunder had spoken its verdict. The distinctive sound of 8 Browning machine guns firing in unison, Roosevelt's piano, German submariners called it. The splash of hedgehog projectiles entering water, the relentless ping of American sonar marking death's approach. These sounds had written the Atlantic's final chapter in a language every U-boat commander learned to understand, the language of overwhelming industrial might systematically applied to the purpose of extermination. And in the silence that followed the absence of wolf packs prowling convoy routes, the empty French submarine pens, the Atlantic crossed now without terror stood the monument to what happened when a nation industrialized warfare completely. The laughter of March 1943 was long forgotten, buried beneath oil slicks and wreckage. The toy boats had proven themselves the most lethal submarine killers ever deployed, and the sky, the ocean, the convoy routes that had once been hunting grounds now belonged entirely and irrevocably to America. The transformation was complete. The reckoning was absolute. And the silence where U-boat diesels once rumbled spoke louder than any victory proclamation ever could.